Hello, today we're going to be talking about the O.J. Simpson trial and how the media has been biased on everything about it. O.J. was accused of murdering his ex-wife Nicole Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman in 1994. Here are two opposing sides talking about how the media has been biased of the whole situation.
Hi, I'm Raquel, and I do not think that O.J. Simpson was guilty.
Hello, I'm Melissa, and I believe that O.J. Simpson was guilty.
The reasons I believe that O.J. Simpson was not guilty was because the prosecution did not provide sufficient evidence to prove that he was guilty. I also believe that many news media sources were racially biased against Simpson and skewed the thinking of many Americans in this case and brainwashed many people to believe that he was guilty when he was not. The media made this case a bigger spectacle than it needed to be and played the race card in this case. Just because he was famous, this case got a lot of press that it didn't need.
Actually, O.J. Simpson was guilty because there was countless sources and evidence to prove that he was guilty. Not to mention, your main argument that he was not guilty is that a pair of gloves did not fit his hand. Additionally, he was known as an aggressive person. This entire topic has nothing to do with race. It is just the fact that a bad man killed his wife and her friend.
Okay, and we're moving on to the next source. An article from UMKC about the jury selection says the fact that, quote, the decision to not file the case in Santa Monica may have been the biggest mistake the prosecution made, end quote, implying that if the case was filed in Santa Monica, the jury pool would have been made up of mainly white jurors and would have convicted O.J. Do you think this was fair to say?
Saying that this was the biggest mistake the prosecution made shows a clear bias from the author. The author is expressing his own opinion that this was the biggest mistake as if it were a fact, when it's not. He goes on in the article to say the defense used, quote, tactics to dissuade the prosecution from challenging black jurors, end quote. Words like tactics and dissuade have a bad connotation that skews one thinking that the defense was doing something wrong by having a black jury, when in fact they were not doing anything wrong by having a predominantly African American jury. He also is implying that this was the biggest mistake, saying that they should have had a predominantly white jury because they would have convicted O.J. Simpson, because the whites would have convicted a black person.
I believe this was definitely fair for the author to say. The jury was stacked with mainly African American judges, and this means that there's not enough representation in the courtroom. There needs to be jurors of all different views, all different backgrounds, for it to be a truly fair jury. That means that there's no bias, and with less bias means an overall more truthful outcome.
So what I'm getting at is you believe if the jury was mostly all of the same race, the verdict could have been different.
No, I believe that the verdict was based on evidence, not on the juror's color of the skin. There's no evidence that if this case was tried with a different jury pool, then the outcome would be any different. This source is just trying to say that African Americans were protecting their own, which is clearly not the case. In the history of the United States, there have been many juries that have been made up of predominantly white jurors, and no one has pointed that as being a bad thing. But now, all of a sudden, having a jury of predominantly African Americans is such a bad thing.
Yes, I definitely believe that the verdict would have come to a different outcome if the jury was not the same race, because if there's equal representation, that would have meant a different outcome overall.
Adding on to that, Kristen Spoler wrote a bold article in the Washington Post about how in her eyes it seems to be unfair that the jury was mostly colored and many of them have ironically had positive encounters with O.J. Simpson in the past. What do you think about it? Does it seem as if the jury was chosen unfairly?
Can we just mention the fact that the title to this article, Majority Black Jury Selected in O.J. Simpson Murder Trial, is in all caps. This all caps allusion makes it have a very dramatic effect, and that it is unbelievable that the jury could be made up of majority African Americans. Even though it mentions in the article that the jury was majority black, they failed to highlight on purpose that two of the jurors were actually white. They did not want to include this information because then it proves that white people could have convicted O.J. Simpson, which was the opposite of what they were trying to write about. And if you read her article more carefully, she uses a lot of sarcasm in her writing, using words such as ironically and it so happens that, which discredits some of her writing.
The jury definitely was chosen unfairly. Race isn't even a topic of issue when it comes to this article because Simpson knew a few jurors before even coming to the courtroom, and he knew them in a positive light. This makes them way more biased, and it's going to make it way harder for them to convict him as guilty when they know him in a good light already. The jury definitely was positioned by the defense.
Media is big on altering photos. So when O.J. Simpson was arrested after the car chase, his mugshot had been taken and it had gone viral. Times Magazine decided to use the photo as their cover page to get more audience than News Weekly. So the editor, Matt Mahurin, decided to alter the photo to make Simpson look darker. How does this make you feel? Do you think it was fair?
The editor was doing nothing wrong. I feel like this was completely fair for him to do. He was just being creative. People don't get upset at the editors who make a supermodel's skin more toned or make their lips a little bit more red, and it's the same thing in this case. He was just making O.J. Simpson's face look a little bit more intense because the situation was intense. He's trying to get people to want to buy their magazine, therefore making it look more intense and interesting.
The difference in the pictures is absolutely disgusting. The Time magazine said that they just wanted to sell more magazines than their competitors, and that meant making him look more black. They could have chosen a different way to alter this picture, but instead they chose to emphasize on the fact that he was African American and chose to make him darker than he really is to give the illusion that being darker makes you guiltier. They wanted to make him look more scarier by highlighting the fact that he was African American. There is no good reason for editing the photo this way except for the fact that it shows how racist the people were against O.J. Simpson.
Moving on to some more opinionated authors. An article from San Francisco Chronicle written by John Diaz talks about how O.J. created a perfect image of himself and had disposable money to create the best defense team. Do you think that this source is credible, and do you agree or disagree with what he's saying?
First of all, I would like to point out the fact that this article was written over 10 years after the trial ended, so the timing of this piece is incredibly suspicious. There was no need to write this article when there are already 100 other articles about this case that are more time relevant. Secondly, I just want to say that John Diaz's job is to write for the editorial opinion column. His job is literally to give his opinion about the pieces he is writing about. So that makes it very hard to take anything he writes seriously. He is super dramatic in all of his reporting and uses a lot of hyperboles in his writings. He says that the murders were brutal, vicious, and that he slayed Nicole Simpson. And he then goes on to call O.J. Simpson repentant and pathological. Now, these words do not seem to be words that someone who is unbiased would use. Clearly, John Diaz had it out for O.J. Simpson.
Yes, I definitely agree with this source and think it's credible. O.J. Simpson was a superstar and beloved by the public. He was an incredible football player who everybody loved. Yet, nobody knew who he was behind closed doors. He created this image of this perfect man with the perfect family. Yet, when the murder case got brought up, so did the fact that he was aggressive and beat his wife. He was also incredibly wealthy. So, who knows? He could have used that money to put together his dream team, his defense team, to fight for this fake, perfect image that he created that was not real.
This last one is from Fox News, and they have reportedly been racist before. So they had written an article about O.J. Simpson's book, having their own opinions, repeatedly saying that his book was full of nonsense. Do you think this is a fair portrayal of O.J.?
Fox News is known as a predominantly Republican news source, with having similar views lining up with some racial bias. This article goes on to say that he was a disgraced football player. They also put hypothetical account into quotes to try to make it seem that this was not a hypothetical situation. The Republican views have made them a terrible source to get this information on.
I believe this is an excellent source. Fox News has been reliable and has been a steady news source that countless Americans have watched over decades. And yes, so people have been faulty before, and bias has slipped in to almost any type of media source. Yet you can't deny the facts that, and all the evidence that incriminates O.J. Simpson as guilty.